Thanks for joining me here today in the Fire Mountain Gems and Beads studio. I'm Lisa Pavelka, and hey, it's time to play with clay. Now, I do love polymer clay, but there's another clay that I like almost just as much, and that's Apoxie Sculpt. It's the two-part epoxy clay that's got kind of a bonus to it because it's not just clay, it's glue. So anything you stick into it before it sets, it's there for good. I like it because it air dries and I can use it in a lot of places where I can't bake. It's wonderful for work with my foils and a lot of other materials, but today what I'm going to show you how to do with it is to make a bead soup mosaic. Now I know y'all have it. There's always those bins and boxes and bags filled with leftover beads, findings, and other whatnots that you've got from your work. It can even be buttons, but I set those things aside knowing that sometimes I'm not going to buy another color of that bead. I'm done with a project and it's not one I need to reorder. And it's wonderful to have these things and find a really good cohesive way to use them together. So I'm working with one of the Fire Mountain Gems and Beads bezel settings, and they come in all different sizes, shapes, and finishes. And I like this trapezoid shape right here. And it does come in other finishes as well as the silver. And you don't need a lot of the Apoxie Sculpt. It's just a foundation. We're really not going to see it. You can work with colors. You can even blend the colors in Apoxie Sculpt. We'll talk about that while I do some blending over here. While you're mixing it, you should work with disposable gloves on your hands. I actually take them off usually when I put it in place, but some people like to have their gloves on their hands the whole time. So I'm going to put these on. And you want to take out equal parts of the hardener and the colored portion of the clay. So even though the hardener here, which is a gray color, has a tint to it, even when I'm mixing white Apoxie Sculpt, even 50% of that gray hardener mixed with the white still ends up with white clay. But I like the black because it frames the components and the little bits and pieces and areas you may not be able to fit a bead or a finding into. You don't notice it. The black kind of fills it all in. It's an optical trick. Now the best way to measure it is just to eyeball it. I'm working here on the silicone glue mat, which is really good for a lot of other uses like this. If your epoxy clay you have left over and it dries and hardens, you'll be able to just pop it right off afterwards. But there's some surfaces if you worked on, this stuff's not coming off once it hardens. So you want to eyeball it, and I recommend taking out how much you think you need. So this ball right here, I'm going to have double that amount of clay. Always start with the hardener first, or the lighter color. So I'll start with white first if I were mixing white, but for all other colors I start with the hardener first. And then it's really about eyeballing. If you're close enough, it's good enough. You don't have to have 50-50 exactly. That's kind of impossible to do, but right within that range. And then what you're going to do is blend the two together. So my recommendation for knowing when it's blended is, you see how it's kind of marbling here? Once it becomes one solid color, you're just going to keep blending it for a minute or two. So while I'm doing that, which is not the most exciting part of any project, is blending, I want to tell you if you want to make new colors, or say you even want to marble multiple colors together where they're not completely blended. Let's say I wanted to take yellow and blue and turn it into green. I would mix equal parts of the yellow with the hardener to equal parts of blue with the hardener. Then I could blend the two together and blend them into the green, or I could stop midway until I see some striation and some marbling going on. But you want to make every color mixed before you combine them with another color. That way you're sure to have the right ratio. So that's been enough chatty time and enough time for me to get this the way I want it. So think about the depth of your piece and how much you need. I sometimes want my components and my mosaics kind of sticking up out of the clay over the edge of the bezel. Or perhaps you're working with a very thin bezel setting, so that's just a given. In this case, I want them seated just around the top edge of the bezel because I might put magic gloss on the top to give it a glass-like finish. It doesn't need magic gloss to hold the beads in place, but that's just going to make them that much more secure. But the epoxy clay or Apoxie Sculpt will do that job. So the best way for me to shape my piece is to kind of start hand molding it into the shape of my bezel setting and getting it in there. And you can use your tools or fingers to move it around and manipulate it. Once I get it mostly filled out, sometimes it's tricky to reach the corners. And at this point, I think I'm ready to take off my gloves. And it's pretty easy to clean up before it hardens. Just use some alcohol swabs or some alcohol on a cotton pad, and we're just going to throw that over there. And I'm going to use a ball tip stylus and just work it, push it into the corners a little bit. And you can clean up your tools using an alcohol swab as well, so that you don't get that residue that's going to dry and be hard on there. Now we need to take a look at what we want to work with. Now I've organized my bead soup here. These are just little bits and pieces that I've had left over from other projects, but it's more than enough to do my mosaic. So you might want to sketch out a pattern beforehand, or you might want to freestyle it like I'm going to start to do. So the two tools I like to have on hand are some diamond tweezers and a needle tool or a beading awl. Either one will work. Now sometimes you'll find it easier to pick up the beads with the awl, and you can just slip them right on the end and just start placing it. I press them down very, very lightly in the clay. You don't want to get too crazy with trying to embed them too deep. I let them actually mostly sit and rest into the clay with just a little pressure, because once I have all of the beads and components in place, that's when I'd push it down. You'll find that if you push too aggressively as you're starting out, a lot of times those things end up getting buried under clay. If you don't like something that you've laid in place, you can easily dig it out with either of the two tools you're working with, and you'll find that you might need to take a little bit of extra epoxy clay to kind of fill that area in. Or if you have a nearby negative space of clay, you can kind of push that in so you can resurface that area. So maybe I just start there, and I started adding a few other things. So I'm going to go jump to my tweezers and work with these bugle beads here. Now we're not going to take the time to do this entire piece. That I think you'll have the idea of how this works long before I get that done, and nobody wants to sit and watch me do the whole thing, or maybe you do, but we're just going to assume that you've got better things to do, like going and making your own bead mosaic. So we'll add a few in there, and again, don't get too fixated. If you don't like it, you can always pull your pieces out and try something different. So you can see I'm just alternating the bugle beads to get a bit of a stripe pattern, and I'm going to work some tiny, like 15 seed beads into the exposed area. Now, that's not to say you have to have every bit of exposed clay has to have a bead in it, or a finding, or a component. And even in the teeniest to tiniest of areas, I might put in just a little crimp bead, the smallest crimp beads. Now notice I have these beads face up. You can see the hole facing up. But sometimes when I'm placing my beads, I like to turn them to the side. And again, that's when I come back to the awl. And I like to have them on their side, like so. And I may do something like a checkerboard pattern. And just alternate one after the other, and then just keep moving so that I have opposite beads facing each other to build up a checkerboard. And you can see something here in this one where I did some lines. I didn't really do any checkerboarding, but where I created wavy lines, and you can tell where I had beads turned on their side. I even introduced a little freshwater pearl in there. So it goes on and on and on. You have anywhere from about 2 to 3 hours of working time. Like any adhesive or glue, Apoxie Sculpt has a shelf life. So usually when you buy it, you've got about a year or two to work with it, to mix it. You'll find it's going to start getting harder to work with the older it gets. And if you find that you've got a little bit of an older batch of Apoxie Sculpt and you haven't used it, it's going to be a little harder to mix it. It's also going to set faster too. It might leave you with only about a half an hour to an hour of working time. You can tell when that happens because you can feel the clay getting stiffer and stiffer as you embed things into it. So you want to work quickly once you have it and finish this piece. Let's say something terrible happens, you spill the milk all over the floor, and by the time you clean it up it started to harden. You can make a little micro layer of fresh Apoxie Sculpt, lay it over the area you didn't get to in time, and work with that. Once this is all laid into place, I would gently press down with my fingers to make sure everything's seated in the clay. It's making good contact. That's how it's going to stick. If for any reason you don't push a component or are finding in deep enough and you find later it comes out, just replace it with the same item or another component. Maybe use just a little bit of the E6000 glue. Now this is one, I like the texture of it, I like the dimension of the items rising up out of the surface, so I don't think I would use Magic Gloss on this one. So I'm going to set this aside. But I did one earlier, and I just want to share a Magic Gloss tip with you. I did one earlier here that I had put the Magic Gloss already on it, but I want to show you something that's interesting. I put a flatback Swarovski crystal inside here, and you can probably see, actually there's two. I'm going to angle it a little bit and let the light bounce off of it. You really can't tell it's a crystal. It probably looks like a tiny, shiny mirror. Once in a while, I get an email from people who are working with my products, and a funny one that I get from time to time is, "Your resin melted my crystal." Well, it didn't melt it. It's actually an optical illusion. So if you like the Magic Gloss resin, which I've got the 1 ounce bottle here, and it even comes in a bigger bottle for you Magic Gloss fans, if you put crystals underneath, the small flatbacks and pointed back chaton crystals don't disappear, they kind of flatten out. It doesn't melt the crystal, it's just an optical illusion where it refracts the light and the facets in such a way that a blue crystal is going to look like a tiny shiny blue mirror. Cool effect, but only if that's what you're going for. Now, larger focal crystals under Magic Gloss still look like crystals, the big fancy stones. So that's fun to know. When I put Magic Gloss on a project like this, there's a lot of areas, there's a lot of crevices and there's holes in the beads, and it takes time for the Magic Gloss to seep into those areas. Magic Gloss, unlike a lot of resins, isn't prone to having problems with bubbles. It can happen, and it's very easy to fix. But it takes time, as I said, for that Magic Gloss to seep down in there. In the time, if I rush it to the light, there may not be a bubble on the surface, something that I can easily pop with flashing for 1 second with a butane light or a butane torch or a windproof lighter. We'll see that in action in just a moment. But if I rush it to the light after I pour a layer Magic Gloss on, and one is really all I should need, the bubbles might be forming as it's starting to cure because it's seeping into the holes in those seed beads or around the tiny openings between the beads. And a bubble has to go somewhere. Air's got to go somewhere. When the Magic Gloss goes in that hole, it's creating an air bubble and it's coming up. It may get trapped as a teeny tiny bubble under the surface that nobody notices, or it may rise to the top like the observation dome on the Amtrak tourist trains. That can be fixed, but it's always easier to prevent a bubble than it is to fix it. So my tip for working with Magic Gloss and seed bead mosaics is to pour a little in, move it around, let it settle, check it with your torch, give it a little flash and pop them. Cure it for 5 to 10 minutes in my UV curing light or out in the sun. Then come back, and if you want that nice raised domed effect, you're going to work on a curing surface, small tile or craft mirror or piece of glass, and we're going to, I always say, we add the Magic Gloss, less than we think we need, because we can always add more, but it's hard to take it away. Adding it in the center, I think I could use a drop or two more. And I see some bubbles, which is good. I want to see if we can catch it on camera of those popping. And I'm just taking that same awl or needle tool and spreading it out to all the edges to get this nice domed effect. Now the chance of bubbles actually forming has been greatly reduced. The bubbles are in there because when I squirted it out, there was some air in the tip, and that air came out with the resin. So working on your tile or mirror here, you can actually rotate it to make sure you get it all the way around. So this happens very quickly. This is kind of cool to see, but right around where I'm pointing, there's some air bubbles. And as long as they're on or near the surface, they'll pop just like that. I don't use a heat gun because I don't want to force the Magic Gloss over the edge, but with the torch safely away from you or anything flammable, we're going to turn on the safety. We're going to pull back and ignite it. And this is how quick I'm going to do it. Watch those bubbles. They're going to pop like that. 1 second. Just like that. I hope the camera caught that action because that's pretty exciting. And into the light it goes for 5 or 10 minutes, and you get a lovely raised glass look on top of your cabochon pieces or on top of your mosaics, like on these right here. Let's turn that on and set that magic gloss. Now, one last thing I'd like to leave you with. Fire Mountain Gems and Beads offers a really cool value-added product, and it's called the Boss's Bead Bag. And it's all this lovely, lovely, delicious beads and findings, and you never know what you're going to get. But there's enough treasures in there that it's more than worth the price of the bag itself, just for the best ones that you're going to love. Here, I took a small candy tin, and I laid out a layer of my Apoxie Sculpt, and I added some goodies that I found in the Boss's Bead Bag. And I'm leaving some of the background exposed as negative spaced as part of my design. And you can see I added different types of textures into the background to make it more visually interesting. Once this set, I can come back and add more Apoxie Sculpt if I want to embellish my border, or even do it with polymer clay. Yes, you can. You can bake this with polymer clay. So I hope you have fun with Apoxie Sculpt and digging back through that bead soup bin or box that you have, and get some great ideas for more creative ways to work with what you've got. And thank you so much for joining me here today. And be sure to go to firemountaingems.com to check out all the other wonderful tutorials and techniques and tips that we have in store for you.